Welcome everybody to this meeting of Transport for the North Scrutiny. I'd like to just welcome everybody, and I'd like to advise you that this meeting has become the AGM as a consequence of the previous meeting being cancelled as a result of the Queen's passing. Our constitution means that we do not have to squeeze another meeting in unless members of the workload suggest we need to at this stage. As today is the AGM, one of the first items on the agenda will be the appointment of a chair and vice chairs. It's my understanding that your existing team, and that includes me of course, is prepared to carry on in post. However, we will get to the vote in a few moments. I briefed today's speakers with the view to finishing the meeting by 1 o'clock or thereabouts. Today's meeting will be recorded, but will not be streamed live. I can tell you, I can see your disappointment. But it will appear later on the website. So, unless there are any questions, I will start the meeting. Thank you, everyone. First of all, are there any declarations of interest? Does it look like there's any declarations of interest? Yeah. I've read the minutes of the previous meeting, and I believe they're a true record. Would somebody like to?
There are a couple of small printing errors. The name Goborn, as in Goborn's link, is misspelt on both page 7 and page 8. Might as well get it right.
Thank you. Could I, is it okay for me to pass them if those two spelling mistakes are corrected?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to hand over to Julie, who will lead the appointment of chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So as you've said, it falls to the meeting today being its annual meeting due to the postponement of the previous one, to elect a new chair and 2 new vice chairs, the majority and minority chairs today. So can I please first of all ask for nominations for the chair, please?
So goes Paul. Last one.
Second.
Second.
Yes.
All those in favour? Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm not sure whether everybody stepped back or you're just pleased with my work, but I'm going to take it that you're pleased with how I attempt to run these meetings. Bear in mind that we do have a large volume of work, and it is appreciated. And I know it's appreciated by the officers that how much work they actually send us to look at. So on vice chairs at the moment, I have the existing 2 people, Julie. So if you just
Yes, the 2 existing chairs are Councillor Fulship and Councillor Hughes.
And I believe both of those are prepared to carry on. Is there any nomination to the contrary of those 2 people carrying on? Julie, it looks like we can carry on as is. Thank you very much, everyone. So that's very good. I've allowed 20 minutes for that section, so we've got an extra 10.
I'll just fill in. I'll just fill in for 2 of those. And because on the cancelled September meeting, we had an update on the scrutiny work during 21-22, and an item on social inclusive transport. Neither of those appears on today's agenda. I just wondered if we could be told why they're not on. It's just through pressure of business.
Good question. The first, both of those items have already been heard by the board, because although our meeting was cancelled, the board did carry on. So both of those items have been, as I said, have been heard. But today's all of the items that are on today are actually coming up in the next board meeting, and I felt that it was more important that we got that. The other concern I'd got was that I know some of us have to travel home afterwards, and we can get these meetings till about 4 o'clock if we really tried.
Yeah, I think we can forget the scrutiny review possibly, but I would like to see the item on social inclusive transport return, please. That's an essential component of the work that TFN does.
We'll bring that back to the next meeting. Thank you very much. Are there any other comments before I move on to item 5? Okay, thank you. We're now going to have a presentation from Brian Sloan, who's going to talk about the independent economic review for the Northern Powerhouse. Essentially, he's here to update us on what's going on. Sadly, none of us can change it, but he's happy to take questions for clarity or if you want further detail. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll just check first of all, everybody can hear me okay? I've got mic'd up here. Yeah. Okay.
Look for the recording.
So we're at a critical point where we're about to receive the outputs from the consultants' work modelling the economic scenarios, and we'll be wanting to share those results with the board in December. So we felt it was important to update you on the progress of this programme and what we know so far from some of the work that we've done with partners across the north. So just as a reminder, the original Independent Economic Review for the Northern Powerhouse was published in 2016. And essentially, what it proposed was that there were 7 key prime and enabling capabilities across the north, which if policy interventions were used, could boost productivity in the north, which would result in an economic prize by the year 2050, which, by closing the productivity gap between the north and the rest of the UK, would add an additional 100 billion GBA by 2050 each year, and an additional 850,000 jobs in that transformational scenario of closing the productivity gap with the rest of the UK. Now, over the course of the last 12 months, what myself and colleagues and officers across the Northern Partners have been doing is we've been involved in a series of work streams split across 2 commissions. And these work streams have been challenging the assumptions that we made in that first IER and developing a set of scenarios. Now, I'm looking to go through each of these work streams. But essentially, those prime and enabling capabilities of the north remain valid today, with the important addition of the foundational economy, so that we ensure that not only do we create transformational growth with our policy propositions in the north, but that transformational growth is socially inclusive and helps us achieve our objective of decarbonising the north's economy. So we're now into this second commission, where we are now about to get the output from the modelling work from the consultants in the economic scenario development. But just to tell you how they're undertaking this modelling, you will see here that through the discussions with partners, the consultants developed 3 benchline scenarios that they were going to model for this work. Now, we have a baseline scenario, which essentially is the do-nothing case. We had a do-nothing case in the 2016 work, and that's why we concluded that in a transformational scenario, we had an economy that was £100 billion bigger and an additional 850,000 jobs. So we've set, again, a baseline. I'm going to talk through some of the detail that we know from that baseline scenario, because we were able to do that earlier in the autumn. But then, emulating the 2016 work, we have a productivity ambition that we want to close that productivity gap between the north and the rest of the UK. And the consultants with partners have looked at 3 change scenarios about how we do this. Each of these scenarios is modelling a package of policy levers. So there's 16 policy levers in total, and each of these change scenarios comes together to close that productivity gap. Now, I have had a taster of the results this morning, so I will tell you that I have had a slight heads up. So I do know that this adjusted productivity ambition performs better when we model all the policies together across the three scenarios than each of the three separately. But we can close the productivity gap by these three separate change scenarios. But in an adjusted scenario, the synergies between the policy packages actually have an adjusted productivity ambition that surpasses our ambition. And in this final scenario, we have an investment proposition. The public sector investment in the north equals that of the rest of the UK. We know that capital investment in the north is lower than it is in other parts of the country. But if we were to even that up, as it is in other parts of the country, what would that do to the North's economy to 2050? Now, I did say I'd talk through some of the baseline work. Now, I hope you can see it from where you are. Now, in this baseline projection based on Cambridge Econometrics annual UK forecast, they've extracted the North from their annual forecast. What we see is growth in the North, in this red line here, is much lower than even the baseline case of the 2016 work or the transformational scenario. And that's the other lines there are some work that Oxford Economics conducted in 2019 as a soft refresh to update the work. So you can see that in both those sets of work, that what we were seeing is that the anticipation for growth in the North was already falling after 2016. Now, this is largely due to weaker productivity, but is also due to a weaker population assumption going forward to 2050. So that's dragging on that baseline do nothing growth scenario. In terms of jobs, what we saw prior to the publication of the 2016 work was that we'd had some strong growth in jobs in the North's economy, and that rather unexpectedly continued after the publication of the 2016 work. We had been expecting in the 2016 work that policy initiatives, if adopted, would take time to kick in to generate jobs growth. But what we saw is that we've now had a period where over the last decade, we've got an additional 750,000 jobs here in the North, which of course is positive news, but most of these jobs have been created in relatively low wage and lower productivity sectors of the economy, such as food services, accommodation, hospitality, and parts of the care sector. So this has done, whilst this is positive news for the labour market, it's actually done nothing to address the wage inequalities and the social consequences of that low wage environment that we have in the North compared to other parts of the country. Now, as you can see, that projection from Cambridge going forward in the do nothing scenario is this line in red here. And you see that it starts to approach the levels of jobs growth that we had in the transformational scenarios of the 2016 and the 2019 refresh. In fact, it gets us to within 200,000 jobs of that additional 850,000. Now, given that weak productivity forecast, it'll come as no surprise that actually many of these jobs continue to be created in those low wage, low productivity sectors of the economy. As I said, accommodation, food services, hospitality and care sector. So if we do nothing, that is what we would expect, that jobs to continue to be created in those low wage sectors of the economy, again stressing that that does nothing to address the inequalities that exist between the North and other parts of the country. But as I said, the ambition remains very much about closing that productivity gap. But as you can see, the blue line here is productivity growth in the North's economy over the last 30, 40 years. And you can see that post-financial crisis, there was a particularly weak period of growth, but that was not very different from the rest of the UK itself, also experiencing a period of relatively weaker growth, having grown at around 2.1% prior to the financial crisis. So, but you can see that actually the gap between the north and the rest of the country is continuing to widen. We've got the impacts of the pandemic here, but going forward, the difference between the blue and the grey line there, you see productivity gap continuing to widen. In the north, productivity growing at 0.8% per annum. The rest of the country growing at 0.9% per annum. So to close this gap, we would need to grow the north's productivity at around 1.2% per annum. Now that isn't impossible. Prior to the financial crisis, the north's productivity was growing at around that national level of 2.1%. But given the overall environment of weaker productivity in the country and some of the fiscal challenges for government, that closing that gap remains as big a challenge as it ever was. Now, I talked about those change scenario levers that were being pulled. Now, I've included this slide just to give you a flavour of some of those policy levers. And I think during the discussion that follows, perhaps I'll come back to this slide. And if people want to feedback or provide any input to what these policy levers are, then I'm quite happy to discuss them. But I just did want to give you some final messages that we've seen limited progress since the 2016 work in closing that productivity gap between the north and the rest of England. But the ambition remains to 2050 that we need to close the productivity gap, and that this work will probably reset some of the headlines of that ambition in terms of the numbers, in terms of that additional GVA and some of the jobs growth going forward. In view of, as I've mentioned, some of the policy and funding challenges that exist going forward. And in practice, we also need to consider the implications for connectivity and transport resulting from some of those policy levers that we're pulling, so that we can feed into the development of the strategic transport plan. So looking forward, we intend to be agreeing over the coming days and weeks with partners across the north, the conclusions from the evidence that we have before we advise TfN board in December on the implications of this work, not only for the STP, but also some of those wider implications in discussions with partners after we start to disaggregate some of those headline numbers for the north by regions, so that we can discuss further the implications coming out of this work. Thank you, Chair. I'll hand over to you for questions.
Thank you very much, Brian. A salutary situation, I think. I'll just ask for questions now. Thank you.
Productivity. What's it measuring? And if you're paying higher wages, in theory, that's more productivity. So as they pay more in the south, are we chasing our tail?
The key about having more productive businesses is so that they can pay higher wages, and this would help to address some of those inequalities that we see. So
I mean, are we measuring national productivity, gross domestic product for the hours worked, which is one measure, or is it sort of accumulating what individual companies do with productivity? It's one of those statistics, I think, you know, whether it's is it reliable as in terms of what value you're getting out of
Well,
What's everybody else?
I'm trying to understand. Are you? When we do the work, we extract the north from the rest of the UK.
Yeah.
So in terms, if we were to improve the north, we're then not measuring against a comparator that's going away from us.
Yeah, no, it's which statistic are we measuring when we say we need to level up productivity? Is it national?
Well, in aggregate, it's output per job, but we do look at
Oh,
individuals.
that's no, because is it just output per job? Because that's what a firm would do. But in terms of national, is it not normally gross domestic product in terms of the input?
Well, we are measuring it in aggregate. We're not measuring it at each individual firm.
So what I'm saying, if somebody working in London is doing the same job and they're being paid a lot more for it, that might be adding more to productivity in the south than it would be where we pay lower.
If they were doing exactly the same job, I would assume that the productivity, it's just, we need more of those highly productive jobs in the north.
Yeah.
And we need to create the environment. So that if I go back to that package,
A merchant productivity in terms of GDP is probably better than a metal basher anywhere. So because, you know, it's adding more to the value of the national economy. I'm just querying what exactly we are measuring by productivity. Don't get distracted on it, Chair.
I think there's an issue that there's a traditional of a sort of a London allowance on top of any salary. So the comparative salary, for example, I think this is what Steve's getting at, is so, for example, if I were a bank manager here or a bank manager in, say, Westminster, I might be doing exactly the same job, but I'd be paid differently just because there is currently a difference because of the cost of living in the sector.
well, we're measuring the gross value added. So it should be the value added from doing that work. I'd take your point about, you know, a London allowance, but
So it was wider than that.
I think some of that would depend on the international value of the pound, wouldn't it, as well? Because even if one group of people are earning more than others, that advantage would be diminished if the pound were at a poor rate competitive. But the questions are two questions. I'm still not absolutely clear who is leading on the Northern Powerhouse. I know we have Henry Mearson, and I heard him speak as an event in Manchester a couple of weeks ago, but after the event, which lasted several hours, I still wasn't much clear on who was leading on the Northern Powerhouse. Is it really central government who are in effect leading on the Northern Powerhouse, or is there some genuine delegated authority? And the second question is the new Prime Minister has made some utterances, I don't know how seriously, about possibly broaching returning to the single market and freedom of movement. Obviously, at the behest of the EU now, we don't have as much say in that, unfortunately. But I wondered whether he's serious or not, because he's a known Brexiter from past experience, whether that might make any difference to that gap that you described that needs to be made up.
so in terms of the Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review, this sits very firmly with TFN as responsibility for delivering that. Although we are joint commissioners with the NP11, although the work to support the delivery of this is being solely done by TFN. But we're working closely with Northern Partners, representative of the LEPs. We've had discussions with officers from various combined authorities, local authorities, and other groups across the north, including, as you mentioned, the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. But I think your point is wider than.
Which is, are we really could be constrained as a body, or we have full freedom to do that? Yeah.
We are. Sorry, you want? I can see you want to jump in.
I'm happy to be Chair. So I think there are two things, Councillor Hughes. One is that the Independent Economic Review, as Brian said, TFN as the only statutory pan-northern body takes responsibility for delivery, but we do that in partnership.
Yeah.
I think the broader question about who owns this agenda remains unresolved, really. It starts as a government initiative 7 or 8 years ago. The NP11, the Northern Leps, are responsible for really taking forward the work, and we're a very close partner in that. Where government's commitment to all of this, beyond the levelling up white paper, I think is part of the next question. Actually, that this research and our engagement and LEP engagement with government will involve.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And the second question.
And your second point was on government.
Freedom of movement and
freedom of movement. Well, what I can say is that as part of the transformational scenario, we would need many hundreds of thousands of additional jobs. Where those jobs come from is obviously a point for discussion with partners. But
if we said irrespective of where the jobs came from, if they were produced through a re-entering of the single market by some mechanism or other, is that's surely going to be beneficial?
Well, a provision of labour is beneficial. Where that comes from is really political
questions. Just evaluation.
Yes, if you increase the supply of labour and if that were through some national policy that improved the supply of labour into the UK.
That's right.
I don't want to be drawn on whether it's
no. You have to evaluate the value of creating a job. But
you can be a politician, Brian. I have 3 questions on this side, please. So you can the variance. Sorry, I can't read your thing. I'm sorry, my eyesight's not.
That's fine, Chair. Thank you. So I've got 2 questions and one more follow up from depending on what you answer. The first one, if that's okay. And it's not trying to trip you up. It's how recent is the data correlated to this? So what kind of time span has this data been collected? That's my first question.
So for depending on the indicator, so we've got labour market data, which is in recent months. GDA data is slightly older. You will see from one of the slides that we do have the data, including the impact of the pandemic. So we are already starting off from a weaker point than in terms of productivity than where we were at the beginning. So it is the latest available data.
So even taking into account the current recession and a lot of financial difficulties we're facing as a country at the moment, we're still projected. Obviously, this is kind of an exponential kind of scale. That growth will keep happening each year, which isn't always accurate. So even with account of the recession, we're still hoping with the investments and the productivity growth that will start to match the rest of the country. Would you say that's like an accurate take from that?
So this is the baseline as was presented based on Cambridge's annual forecast, which is produced was produced in March this year. So their 2022 forecast, and they base this baseline. They have made adjustments to the baseline as they've been conducting the transformational modelling. So what I've presented to you today is the original baseline, but that will be updated when we see the final published work. So it will account for some of the weaknesses in the economy as a result of the current downturn. There are some adjustments being made. But yes, trying to then forecast going forward that a recession, for example, would happen sometime in the 2030s. It's just not particularly feasible. So we're looking at trend. This is a trend over a number of years, looking further out into the forecast.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was just worried. Obviously, if the data is from March, it's not going to have all the recent events that we have faced
with the economic downturn that we are experiencing right now. So that was just my worry that it's not going to be strictly accurate. But if you are saying it's been updated in recent months, then I'm happy with that.
Yeah, it has been updated, and I think also an important point to make is that some partners have also fed back on locally specific data. So not only are we getting updated data, but we're also adjusting for some of the nuances of some local data which you don't see with that aggregation at the whole level of the economy. I don't want to go into specifics because I'd have to name certain LEP areas, but if you think of a major defence contractor, for example, that might be building something that goes underwater, we're trying to adjust for some of these local nuances.
Okay, thank you, Chair. That's my question.
Councillor Fox.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned working with LEPs. Have you a link to South Yorkshire Mayor Combined Authorities Strategic Economic Plan? Given that there's a recognition that sustained growth will require focus and investment on wider policy levers such as skills, research and development.
Yes, absolutely. We have, as part of this work, so as part of the first work stream, in fact, it was this work stream was in the first commission. So the consultants held workshops with each of the 11 local enterprise partnership areas across our geography, and there was groups of officers. Each of them was a specific LEP area, so there were groups of officers from those areas at each of those meetings, and the consultants also reviewed the strategic economic development plans that had been published in each of those areas. So there is we haven't published it yet, but we will be publishing local area profiles, which include references to all the strategic plans in each of those areas that have been referenced by the consultants. So there is a body of evidence that underpins how we've developed these scenarios. And just going back to your point on skills, as you can see in some of these policy levers, things like education and skills spending is something that came through very, very strongly in those discussions. This isn't just about creating growth; it's creating growth that's socially inclusive and that decarbonises our economy. And this came through very strongly from those LEP workshops, and those same officers have been involved in a series of workshops that we held over the course of the summer to refine some of the detail. And in fact, actually, I can tell you that I'll be having another discussion with those LEP areas tomorrow morning when we find the results of the draft results of modelling.
So I just time for Councillor O'Connor.
Yeah, sorry. Chair. Thanks for your presentation. Just one is just a full practice on a comment. Just a comment about you talked about the jobs that have been created over the last years or whatever, and you were saying that they were mainly in the care profession, retail, etc., logistics. We're obviously being recorded here. It's going live. It won't be going live. We'll be going to other people. I think we need to emphasise that those jobs are very important, just as much as any other job. I'm not taking this. This is not. I'm just saying this is that the way it came across was that we've got these care jobs. And the care industry is absolutely vital to the people and to the health of the region. As is logistics, retail, people who it's not just filling the shelves anymore at Aldi. There's a lot of other skills, different levels that people go right up to area management, some of them on £70,000 a year. So it's not just it's a way in for people. So that's very important. And I think we need to emphasise that, particularly for the people on the outside of the meeting, because it wouldn't be very remiss of us because we make it look as if we don't care. And I'm sure you actually do. It's basically the question really I wanted to ask is about what type of high-end jobs are we looking at? What type of jobs over and above care workers and that we need? What type of jobs that would come into the region that was actually bringing a lot more?
To take your first point, absolutely, I completely agree about jobs in these sectors of the economy, and particularly in the care sector, the jobs that we value particularly highly. Unfortunately, they're particularly well paid, many of them, which when we need it, we do value. So I absolutely take your point. My thread the second the high-end jobs. I do know from the discussion that I've got with consultants this morning that so the prime and enabling capabilities are performing well in the economic transformation. The prime and enabling sectors of the economy are performing very well in the transformational scenario. So we do see jobs growth in areas such as advanced manufacturing and particularly in the energy sector. Again, you'd expect to see that given some of these scenarios, decarbonising the economy. We also see investment in sort of land transport, so machinery from that investment and that need to change fleets from current internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. So you see investment in machinery driving, again, feeding into those sort of high-end manufacturing jobs. Sorry, I did remember the point I wanted to come back to on when I was thinking about your point on the care sector. One of the things I don't think I probably emphasised it enough, that the difference between the 2016 work and this refresh work is that, as well as the prime and enabling capabilities, we're also focusing on the foundational economy. And the foundational economy is things like healthcare, the basic things that we all need to live our lives, food production. So we're in the future publication, the importance of this part of the economy will be stressed. And I did refer to it as the foundational economy, but I probably should have explained more about what that exactly that is. And so that's your point.
Okay, one last question from you, sir, Steve.
So it was an observation much about language as anything else. Looking at that list, they're all highly desirable things. But the title change scenario levers in the context of what we're doing, in transport, it does sound a bit like rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, while Northern Powerhouse Rail is predominantly it's all below the waterline now.
Brian,
Go on.
can I just close the item on this one, because I can take this one. This is a really giving us a complete background to the economy across the whole of the north of England, and I think we've got some seriously good things to take back to our councils, not in terms of necessarily transport for the north, although this is to give us context on some of the decisions that are made here. But I'm going so one of the things I would like you to do, Brian, is when you've got the final presentation that you'll be sending to the board with the things that you've hinted at. I would love for all the members around the table to get that, because I think there are things that are valued that we can actually contribute to our own councils, and if some of us are involved with LEPs as well, I think that's very important. Those 16 policy levers, I think, are quite helpful when it comes to perhaps judging papers that we see at local level. So, and I'd love to know what the capital investment number you come up for with levelling up is at the end of the day. So we'll be waiting for that number. I'm not sure my piggy bank will go that far, but I'm hoping somebody's will. And I think the final comment that I would just take from the meeting here that I've sort of sensed is, people can shout at me if not, but I do really think that the North really needs somebody to take the lead on this, and it's it's very sparse, you know, sort of, we have a Prime Minister, you know, I mean, the Prime Minister is now in Richmond, in North Yorkshire, so maybe we, you know, we maybe need to enlist him in some way, shape or form, but we certainly need some leadership where it all comes together in the North. And that's, and I get that concern from people that there's all these great things, but there's nobody sort of leading the charge. Is that an unfair statement?
I mean, Tim mentioned the point about ownership, and this was actually one of the things that came out of Workstream 4. So it is one of the discussions that we are having with partners, that, as Tim mentioned, remains unresolved at this point. But I take your point, and we'll have those discussions with partners about moving that agenda forward.
You'll want to move on, Paul, but we've got some mechanisms, some conversations going on about how we do just that.
Thank you, Brian. It's now the rail update with David Hogarth. He's going to present the current performance position and also issues around rail reform, which I think they both knock into each other, but we're actually being asked for our input into the rail reform and how we can perhaps contribute to that. So, and I welcome our two latecomers, because I know you've got to add value to this particular part of the debate. So thank you. Over to you.
Thanks, Chair. And yeah, it's in two parts really. So partly it's the report back from Rail North Committee, and that's why the paper was a little bit late. We want to capture the discussion at the committee last week, and then it's forward looking to the board in terms of the rail reform.
You've got your own slides.
Yeah, I'm not doing any slides, so I'll watch this for later. So I'm just referring to the paper. We'll start with good news. The growth in rail in the north is growth back after COVID has been higher than many other parts of the country. So recent stats say our major stations run by about 87% of pre-COVID. London stations 71%. So that's the good news. We've got something to build on there. Bad news is performance has been very, very poor. I think everybody knows that. It travels around by rail. No doubt about that. And the future of funding for rail is uncertain as well. But we start from that strong growth back. So we've looked as well at the impact of the recent performance problems on the north, and we can see that the cost of delays and cancellations, just at looking at Northern and Trans-Pennine Express, is around £8 million a week. We calculated that figure. That's 0.4 billion a year. And actually, these problems that we're seeing at the moment have been going on for the best part of a year, and we're not sure, obviously, at this stage when they're going to be resolved. Now, the problems that the committee have been exploring, the Rail North Committee, are varied. Actually, a big part of this is about the backlog of training for drivers in particular through COVID. But there's also high sickness in there. There's been a higher number of drivers leaving the industry than expected, or leaving our operators in the north to go elsewhere. And there's a lack of flexibility around overtime work, and of course the whole industrial relations position and strikes that we're seeing is all part of the mix as well. So the operators presented to Rail North Committee, they both, in terms of Northern and Trans-Pennine Express, got recovery plans that are being monitored through the Rail North Partnership, which is our local contract management, jointly managed by TfN and the Department for Transport. We also heard from a representative from Avanti, because of course that has been a big problem in the north in terms of the same sort of issues, albeit manifesting themselves differently over recent months. So there was good discussion between committee members, very robust discussion, I think, with those operators. I think one of the things that came out of there, though, is whilst, of course, there are things that are the responsibility of operators, and the committee and Rail North Partnership will hold them accountable, there are other things that are outside their control, and in particular, the committee resolved to seek flexibility for the operators to put in place short-term rest-day working agreements, it's called, which would get around some of the current problems of high sickness and training backlog. The other thing, which is more longer term, is the committee resolved to seek commitment to progressing a training academy for the North. And this is a really strong development where it's been developed initially through Northern Rail, but it would be for the whole industry in the north of England, providing a supply initially of drivers, because that's where the biggest need is, initially for rail, but it is actually something that could be then rolled out to other transport requirements, particularly on buses as well. So that's something that we think there could be some very strong early commitment to. And there's a few other recommendations that the committee came up with in terms of holding operators to account and improving customer service. And there is actually a meeting between some of the northern elected mayors and the Transport Secretary of State planned in the next few days or weeks to explore some of those issues further. The other thing that the committee looked at on their agenda was actually some of the things we could do to unblock congestion. It's not all about staffing and rail operators. We know that the network is very congested. We know that we need the big investment like Northern Powerhouse Rail, Central Manchester upgrade, etc., etc. But actually, there's some small and medium-sized schemes. We've identified 121 interventions that we could just crack on with that don't cost a huge amount of money, that would deliver some real benefits in the short term. So one of the things is through the committee seeking some devolved funding for Network Rail to get on with those schemes that actually unlock some of the congestion points. The second half of the paper really then goes on to rail reform, and many of the issues we're seeing on the rail network go right back to the problems around May 2018 that we discussed at length at TFN meetings in the past. We're still seeing some of the same challenges about lack of accountability, lack of a single point of accountability, which of course the white paper that was produced back in 2020, I think it was now, was designed to resolve by putting together a single organisation to oversee the industry, Great British Railways. So we know that the progress on that is a bit unclear at the moment. I think is the polite way to put it. We're still hearing there's a commitment to do it, but the legislation is going forward this parliamentary session. So really this paper explores what can we do in the north to deliver on some quick wins that would actually deliver many of the things in the white paper. Particularly things like creating regional business units, where we actually give much more say for local authorities, elected mayors in local areas to get much more involved with holding operators to account, but more than that, planning the services and integrating services with light rail, with bus, and doing integrated ticketing and fares reform as well. Pay-as-you-go ticketing is obviously something that we've been pushing for a long time at Transport for the North. We're not delivering that anymore on rail. That's being now delivered nationally, but we're actually saying there's a real opportunity here for the North to be a pilot area, several areas in the North. There was a commitment in the integrated rail plan to deliver pay-as-you-go ticketing on rail within 3 years. I think that was a year ago, so there's 2 years to go on that, and actually we want the North is ready. Again, Northern Trains have done a lot of work on that with us and are ready to go on that, start rolling that out. So that could be a quick win as well. And then on stations as well, been a lot of good work done, Greater Manchester, West Yorkshire as well, and other areas, looking at integrating stations more into master planning communities, looking at how you can get better use out of railway land and making stations more welcoming, and modernising as well. Looking at things like how tickets are sold, how people are buying tickets, and modernising the way that works as well. The point with all of this is do it in the north, from the north. Don't wait for a national initiative. A national initiative might not be the right way to do it in the north. We've got the Rail North Partnership, we've got the partner authorities, we've got some really good examples of what we could do. We could be a showcase and pilot for the north. So that was one of the aspects. And actually, we need to do this. If we're going to deliver on decarbonisation, we need to grow rail as a mode. It's only 1 to 2% at the moment. We need a plan for doing that. And actually, we've got a plan. It's called the Strategic Transport Plan, and we're updating it and refreshing it as you go into here. So we've got all the evidence. We've got some great evidence. We've got the transport models. We've got the economic evidence. Let us do that in the north and let it be our plan rather than a national plan that's sort of handed down from London. So in the final part of the paper, there's another set of principles that we're asking the board to endorse really for further rail reform. That includes actually having an identified budget for the North so that elected members can make decisions based on that budget and prioritise things based on that budget. And we haven't had that in the past, and we have to try and second guess what funding might be available. But we can make those decisions based on evidence if we know what the budget is. So that's the kind of principles in the report. As I say, we're going to develop that for the board. There's an opportunity today for this scrutiny committee to help with that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, David. I'll hand it over to the committee for questions, and really what I'm hoping is that you might have some suggestions or solutions or recommendations. And we already have a starter for 10. Please carry on.
So we're going to start to make it, but
Yeah.
the question quite, I mean, obviously I'm from Blackpool, and Blackpool South Line's been a bloody mess for as long as I've been a councillor. And how strong is the budget going to be for an overall plan? Because we've had a diminished rail service over the last 5 or 6 years, but they keep giving Northern Kent keep giving funny reasons for it. We know part of it is because if they delayed a little bit at Preston, because the capacity is not there at Preston, it costs some money. So, but my question is the overall plan going to include all the branch lines as well? Because they can be as important. I mean, you've got mayors in Manchester, mayors in other places, but places like Blackpool, Blackburn, and smaller towns don't have the large influence on it. Then it seems that there's not an overall plan throughout the network to look after all the branch lines, and I mean, particularly Blackpool, who were trying to get more and more rail passengers coming in, but they took capacity out. The South File line, they've been promised us for 10 years a passing loop or getting it moving so that it's more efficient. I know the biggest problem over the last few years has been the staffing, but that's been the problem of the question is, are part of the plan is going to be an overall plan that includes all the branch lines as well as the busy ones in and out of the major cities?
Yes, I mean, I can reassure you, our plan, the Transport for North plan, will encompass everything across the North, and that's the benefit of us taking that overview. But absolutely, the branch lines are just as important to those local communities as the long distance lines. And I think this is probably the different perspective, because when we're looking at budgets and funding, there is certainly at the moment, there is an emphasis on looking at cost reduction and an emphasis on where the biggest passenger flows and revenues come. And that's just one, that's quite a narrow view. The rail network is part of delivering on a social inclusion policy as well. It's doing much more than just generating revenue across the North. So we're actually going to produce some work that kind of highlights the wider benefits of the role of rail in the North and have that available in the next month or so. But the kind of broader point is, will there be enough money? I don't know the answer to that. What I can say is we are concerned, and the Rail Committee is concerned, that the signs are that there will not be enough money, not only to support the existing services, but the growth that is needed. So we really want to use our evidence base, your experience, your kind of deep knowledge to put that case out there in terms of this should be a positive. Invest in the rail in the North, you will get more revenue, you reduce the subsidy, and you deliver the wider benefits.
Thanks.
Councillor Davison.
Still working. Interesting to look at the stats, but ultimately, I mean, if I just take the amount of travellers, the percentage now is 80% back from pre-COVID. Well, the paper doesn't seem to take into account the new dynamic in home working, and it may be that the peak was pre-COVID in terms of rail travel. We'll never recover back to where we were. I mean, personally, I'm not the greatest fan of home working, but even my own authority has gone on to flexible working, and our offices are quite empty. The staff love it. Seen a few people returning because they don't want to keep the heating on at home now. That's some of the council pay. But there's still an awful lot of homeworking going off, and I think that's had a profound effect on both rail and road. You know, buses are in a pickle anyway, especially in rural areas, and I don't think there's an easy solution to buses. But when it comes to the plans for the network, I look obviously as an ex-P-way renewals engineer in terms of the capability of Network Rail to deliver any plans, and basically there isn't any. Network Rail, regardless of our work, will have their own strategic plans, which are based on the priorities of the state of the infrastructure. Line speed improvements, electrification, they're all in their plans anyway, even if we didn't exist. They will be going ahead with a package of renewals, which frankly, before Transport for the North, they struggle to deliver in any event because they don't have the signalling staff, they don't have the engineers, they just simply don't have the capability to do anything grandiose. So I'm really concerned that we're going to be producing a document, which I think we must do. You know, I think we must have a strategic vision for the rail infrastructure. It's very important to the North, but we're really looking at the corridors east-west, I think, and thinking that we're going to get branch lines back is cloud cuckoo land. The only thing they like to do with branch lines is close them again. And when we look at the Great British Railways idea, now, I remember when it was nationalised, British Railways was a bloody mess. They had no money. The only way they could actually get the infrastructure back and invest in the lines that they considered important was to bring beaching in and take them all up. We had miles and miles of old bullet infrastructure. Now, most of that now has been upgraded to concrete sleepers and CWR, so it's not in bad nick. It's more a matter of keeping that maintained and going. So the real question is, can we introduce some reality into this? Because at the moment, I don't think the country's got any money. From what I've heard on the news, we've got a few billions of a black hole. I'm not convinced that Rishi Sunak, whilst he might be an MP for Richmond, he ain't from Richmond, is he? He's a parachute-in MP. So, I'm not convinced that there's any great support. HS2 up to Leeds has been axed already in Boris's time. So, it's great. We're spending an awful lot of money on reports. We're spending an awful lot of money on consultants, and we actually haven't laid any traps, as far as I can see, over and above what Network Rail would probably have done anyway. So they're more observations than questions, I have to be honest with you. And I'm not cynical about it, but you wonder why we're all sat here sometimes, quite frankly. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Davis. And I'm not going to ask you to answer that, David, you'd be pleased to know. One of the comments I am going to just pick up on, though, is I'm a believer in imperfect action rather than perfect inaction. And we seem to be stuck in the perfect inaction loop at the moment. And so you made reference to, I think it was 121 short-term wins. And I think one of the things that perhaps we should go away with, and we are all of different complexions when it comes to political parties, but maybe we have to nudge our MPs, and the MPs in the North have to turn around and say, hey, look, we need you to take a northern perspective on the railway, and perhaps we are ready and willing, and maybe that's a message we have to take away to try and get this going, because I think all the observations that I've just heard are very true. So I do think that if we are going to get some movement, that maybe there has to be some political will, whichever party it comes from. So I would encourage that. I'll now ask Councillor Hughes, and then I've got Councillor Salt.
Just to make a few observations also, Chair, but there are questions in there as well. And first I'm going to say, I think Councillor Davison made his point as well, but I hope that TFN, both through scrutiny and the board itself, will still be arguing very forcibly for modal shift. Because if we don't, we might as well just all go home and not even work from home, because it's about the economy, it's about the environment, it's about tackling transport-related social solutions. So I hope we, basically still agree with that. I'm intrigued by the mention of double devolution in paragraph 3.5. The form I know in is an excellent idea. I hope the term is being used similarly here, but I think I'd like to ask for a bit more information on what's implied here. Thanks. Similarly, the idea of a single region for the north, well, I think this is referring to that in terms of the rail industry, not as a political concept, but both, I have to say, so it might be preferable to the status quo. And I'm always impressed if I go to France or Germany, how well the regional authorities in those countries organise the railways. I mean, obviously everything isn't perfect there either, and trains can still be late or not turn up, but by and large, you know who's in charge, and the local people tend to know who their elected members are and who they can contact, even at regional level, which I think is excellent. Just on the, I probably shouldn't speak on Manchester issues as for everything Cumbria, but I really would like to see that the fares and the bookings for the Greater Manchester tram network integrated into the main rail system. That's long overdue, and it's ludicrous that I go to Oxenholme Station and I can't buy a through ticket to somewhere on the GM network. But that's just a thought. I hope we'll keep lobbying for a statutory role, as David stated, and for a proper budget. And I did have one sort of proper question, if you like. The Greater Manchester Task Force, again here, this is in 3.9. It says that there'll be a report back on whether the task force thinks the intended benefits have been delivered, and I don't think we've had any up-to-date information on that. So again, maybe outside the meeting, but I know it'll be a slow iterative process, but we could hopefully get there at some point.
Chair, can probably quickly address some of those points. Double evolution, I think it actually links to your first point, because one of the things we can do at the moment, we can set up these things called regional business units, which would be not just Greater Manchester, but be Liverpool City region and the surrounding Shire areas as well, working together. One of the things we actually have some powers to set fares at TfN. That's something that is devolved down. That could be used locally to integrate fares, so to change from the national fare system to make them integrate with tram and bus. So that's an obvious quick win that would benefit people in the way you mentioned. In terms of the task force, that's specifically the timetable coming up on change coming up on the 11th of December, which will be actually is a bit of a step back in the Manchester area in terms of connectivity, but it's supposed to deliver a step change in reliability. So the task force are going to monitor that around into the new year, and we'll report back so we can update on that. I have to say though that the general position on performance and the industrial relations and strikes is not going to make it easy for passengers. It's not going to make it easy to disentangle the base timetable change from everything else that's going on. So there is a bit of a risk there.
Thank you. I've now got Councillor Salter, and then final question from Councillor Curley. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a few comments. I also wanted to sort of comment on something Councillor Davidson said. I'll try and be quick. So on, I think a lot of what Councillor Davidson said was absolutely bang on, and it's a bit of a tough message, but and I have also sometimes had slight concerns of thinking in terms of the use of the rail network post-COVID. Could we be, at least in the short term, in a position where it just doesn't recover? And I think time will tell on that front. But I do think that in terms of what the North needs to be saying, we need to be saying, look, the starting point that we're at, the infrastructure that we're at, has been so underinvested in for 50, 60 years, that even if rail as a whole is not going to be as used as we had hoped it would be, surely the government's got to focus its investment here. We need to make that case and at least keep banging the drum in that sense. I wanted to ask as well, in terms of something that was discussed around North Committee, there was reference to the training academy for the North. That jumps out to me as at the very least, the kind of project that could be a source of really good PR and very eye-catching as an area for development. How stuck in with that is Transport for the North, and to what extent is that just what the operators are doing, and we're just sort of I don't know, at the table, giving them a pat on the back, whatever. But that just seems something that, to me, jumps out as we should be having that as high profile as possible. In terms of Great British Rail, do we have a sense of whether it truly is delayed, or is this the end of Great British Rail in the way that it was envisaged? And I think that the paperwork that we received isn't quite clear on that. I think if you're reading in the media, you could get a different impression on that. So I'm interested in that. I'll leave it at that, but yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the comments. And I think, yes, this kind of post-COVID use is a real kind of understanding that as the baseline is fundamental to this. But I think it goes back to, you know, are we going to have a growth? Do we still want the growth railway in the north, or do we want the opposite, which is a declining railway? What does the strategy need? And I think the answer to that is clear in terms of growth. Now, yes, it's a very mixed picture because, you know, I quoted the 81%, but somebody else mentioned earlier that, of course, commuting is still down. That might be about 50 to 60% in general, but not every day. You know, Mondays and Fridays are quieter. Middle of the week is busier. Leisure and weekends are back to 100% or more than they were pre-COVID. So it's a different market that's emerging. And Northern Trains had the third highest week ever for revenue and first take in the last few months, in the last few weeks actually. So it is a mixed picture. But what it means is we have to, I think, be adaptive. So going back to exactly the same services that we had pre-COVID is probably not the answer. Maybe being really creative. We're already seeing a plan now to run extra services to Scarborough from next summer, but not all year round necessarily, and not at all times of the day. So looking at things like that, looking at other leisure destinations. Training Academy, yeah, we are plugged in. It's an initiative that, yes, Northern Trains developed initially, but through the Rail North Partnership, we're working really closely with them. So just to give you an example, we met with the Rail Industry Association to look at their support and ideas on that. Just a couple of days ago, we're meeting with the skills leads from combined authorities because they've got links to the kind of wider skills agenda that they can bring to that. So we're trying to play a strong coordinating role, and also looking at the funding package that would come through Rail North Partnership for that as well. So absolutely, that, you know, we think there is something really, really strong there. GB Railways, I think the paper, I'm afraid, isn't clear because we're not clear, just as you're not clear. There were some positive comments I heard made by the Rail Minister at an event recently about still wanting to go forward with it. It's just the legislation isn't reflecting that. So I think we're waiting to see, but it's kind of back to the point. But there are things we could get on with and do in the north anyway.
Thank you, Councillor Foley.
Thank you again, Chair. Thank you for the report and presentation on it. It's quite interesting. I've got a couple of points, and I'll keep them short but sweet, like electrifying the Hull to Selby line, which I had to drop in there at some point in the meeting, Chair. So with these regional business units, are we looking at the potential for something like a SUDA or minor transport authority in the idea? So that'd be my main question there. Question 2 would come down to the training academies, which is going to be done by the rail operators. Is this going to be a holistic training academy in the sense of we're not just going to be training drivers, but we're going to be doing operators, technicians, other essential workers that we need to maintain the rail lines? And so those are my 2 questions, and thank you again, Chair.
Yes, on the regional business units, I think it's a phased approach. So what we have at the moment within our Rail North Partnership is the ability to create those. In effect, they'd act as agents, so we wouldn't be replacing what the Rail North Partnership, which is what the TFN do, but we'd be working on their behalf essentially. So that's how it would work. But of course, you know, in further stages of rail reform, then it might be possible to do more. But as a reassurance, it's not changing the governance of TfN or authorities in any way. It's more about the work on rail. And then on the training academy, yeah, I think that will be the idea. The focus is very much on the biggest need on train drivers, but with an eye to that could be developed. I think the point was made earlier on about engineering staff as well. That's why we're talking to the Rail Industry Association, because they're already plugged into the various colleges and universities that are working in that agenda. So I think our approach is to start with the core of this and the biggest need, but then have a model that could be developed out further. The good thing with Northern being part of this is they are a government-owned company at the moment, so they don't have that sort of individual vested interest. They can genuinely do it on behalf of the North and all train operators. Thanks.
Thank you, David, for that very comprehensive report, and thank you, committee, for some very comprehensive observations and robust observations at that. You survived, David, so thank you. I think the two things that really lead back to me is one is, I'm putting words into your mouth, but I suspect a centre of excellence for training for from whatever level they are, because I think it's important that people understand their part they play in it, not just the part that they actually do. And then the other side of this is as being, and I think we're all very conscious of climate change, is that there is a need for modal shift. So even if not as many people are using the train during the week, we still have to get people from one mode of transport to another. And I think that's an absolute critical. And if I were to look at the levers that were on the previous thing, then I think that is a lever that we need to pull. If we are to play our part in decarbonisation, then I think that is absolutely an essential thing that has to happen. And we've got to make the trains attractive for people to use them. So thank you very much, David. I'd now like to move on to Lucy, who's got our strategic transport plan. And she has asked for us to comment on her latest version of the strategic transport plan. But in particular, she's very keen that if we spot any showstoppers, that we tell her now and not in January when she brings it back again. So the important thing is if there's anything we see that we feel might not be helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got a couple of slides to kind of talk through. Clearly, we've shared some papers for today's meeting, and I'm happy to kind of take some comments and thoughts on that. But equally, we did have an item on the agenda for the cancelled meeting, which was more focused on the vision and objectives chapter as well. So again, I'm happy to kind of take comments from the committee on either aspect. But I thought it'd be good to just start with a bit of an overview on where we are in terms of SDP2. I'll talk through some of the work we've done over the summer, so including that work that we wanted to talk to you about in September, as well as the work that we were hoping to talk you through today, and then we'll kind of open it up and we'll take comments on any of it. So I think this slide's quite helpful because it just gives a really good overview, I guess, of where we are in terms of our development, and it's a bit of a plan on a page. So you'll recall that this is the structure that we agreed with our partners back in March or June, if I quite recall, that we're going to use for SDP2. So there's 4 fundamental chapters: the case, the vision, policy in place, and the impact. And the headline percentages give you a bit of an indication of where we are really, and I'll go through that in a bit more detail shortly. My plan today is to talk through the first 3 kind of chapters and give you a good overview of where we are with those. Happy to take kind of comments, feedback, thoughts on that at the moment. And then, as I mentioned, kind of, I'm not quite sure of the scrutiny dates for the new year, but kind of February time we'll be coming back to bring back SDP2 in its draft form through full governance before we take that to board in March. So just a reminder of the milestones and the deadline dates we're working to on our second strategic transport plan. So as per what we agreed with our board way back in September last year, we've agreed to kind of have all of our policies and evidence signed off through December governance this year, so that we can kind of continue the drafting and have a pretty firm draft in place by mid-February. So we're quite well on the way with that, but there's quite a bit more still to do, really. We've committed with the Department for Transport to have a session with them and their ministers middle of February to look at a quite comprehensive full draft, so 95–98% of a draft. And that's really to kind of make sure that their ministers are briefed on what we're asking for, make sure that they kind of understand, you know, the rationale behind our STP and where that's pitched at, really, so we can kind of get their support in advance. Then, as I mentioned, you know, through February and into March, we'll be going through the full TFN governance process on that kind of draft STP too. We'll be bringing that back to scrutiny in due course. And then the plan is, once board agree that in March, we'll do a full public 12-week consultation next summer as part of our statutory duty. So there'll be a series of events running throughout the summer. There'll probably be a kind of online kind of platform that people can kind of go to as well to kind of give feedback, etc. And then we'll have a bit of time to revise it before we take it a final version back through governance November, December next year for adoption. So quite a bit more work to do, but you know, the milestones are coming thick and fast, and that March deadline is really critical for us, really. So as I said, there's a couple of kind of key chapters we've been doing some work on behind the scenes that I want to kind of give you a bit of an overview of, and we'll bring this back for more kind of detailed discussion in the new year. But the first is the case for change chapter. So I think it's probably fair to say we're about 80% of the way there with that, and Brian has been leading that on our behalf, working with a number of colleagues across the organisation. But fundamentally, the case for change is doing just that. It's setting out why transport in the North needs an investment, what are the North's unique kind of challenges that we face and opportunities, and how can transport help unlock that. And it's underpinned by three key pillars, really. So the economic case linked to the NPIER work Brian talked through earlier, the social case linked to the work that we've done on transport-related social exclusion and the social inclusion policy that we're currently out for consultation on, and then the environmental case, which is linked to our decarbonisation strategy and the work we've done on that previously. So they're the kind of three key pillars that are underpinning the case for change and the whole of the STP too. And again, as with the 2019 SDP, there's those kind of three key drivers, I guess, in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So, you know, addressing that productivity gap that Brian mentioned before, then obviously making sure that the North's environmental, human and economic assets are dispersed and not hampered by continued poor transport connectivity. And then again, making the case about the fact that actually, you know, the North's towns and cities are sufficiently close together, but actually, you know, improved connectivity could really lead to agglomeration benefits and productivity growth and improved outcomes for our residents across the North. That's the kind of underpinning kind of narrative throughout. There's a series of kind of sub-chapters within the chapter. So we're drawing out the challenges and opportunities. We're then talking about the North's places, people and businesses, the transport system and the challenges of that we face. Of course, the economic landscape underpinned by the NPIER work we talked about, the societal landscape underpinned by that transport-related social exclusion work that partners have worked with us on. The environmental and sustainability challenges, so that's the stuff contained in our decarbonisation strategy, but it does go further as well. So it picks up on some of the aspects that our integrated sustainability appraisal are picking up. So there's some broader aspects we need to consider, and that kind of reflects on that. So aspects around climate change resilience, biodiversity, etc., and considerations around that. We're also drawing on our future travel scenarios to talk about, you know, if our plan goes up to 2050, which it does, actually, you know, there's not just one vision of the future. We don't have a crystal ball, so we need to be pragmatic and flexible in our approach, and we need to kind of develop the plan based on that. And all of that kind of links across to our next chapter, which is our vision and objectives chapter. So fundamentally, the case for change is pulling together all of the evidence that we've developed over the last 4 years and trying to really set that a strong and kind of compelling argument to government around why the North's challenges are perhaps more unique than other parts of the country, and therefore why we need more investment. The next kind of big fundamental chapter, and the papers that we shared with you for the September meeting that we didn't have kind of touched on this in more detail, is the vision and objectives chapter. So again, over the summer, we've done a huge amount of work around this with partners to kind of really lock this down. And ultimately where that's led is we've kind of revised our strategy hierarchy for SDP2. So we've revised the vision based on feedback from partners around what they would expect to see. And most of that feedback was around broadening the vision. So our vision in SDP1 was very much focused around economic growth and transport as an enabler of that. And that's absolutely still important. But we know now that, you know, politically, socially, you know, we want a range of different outcomes. We want to deliver on the decarbonisation commitments we've made and national government have made. We want to make sure that growth is balanced and fair and plays into that levelling up agenda. So the vision's been revised slightly to kind of broaden that out and reflect where we are now, I guess. Underneath that, we've set 3 strategic ambitions. So essentially, these are the outcomes that we want to see, and I'll come back to that shortly. And then beneath those ambitions, we then set a series of headline and core objectives. So this is something that we didn't do in STP1, but we've set some SMART objectives for the headline objectives. And then for the core objectives, we've set a series of, we can kind of balance that based on, you know, what good looks like. So, you know, would you expect these indicators to go up or down if we're going to achieve the vision? So we've done a huge amount of work internally and then with partners to develop those headline and core objectives to make sure we've got appropriate baselines in place. We've got data sets available to enable us to kind of monitor and track our progress over time on that, and also to enable us to help set what past targets would be. So that was quite an in-depth process that we did over the summer. And in the paper that I shared with you previously in September, we've also kind of outlined, you know, between those 3 strategic ambitions, so the economic, social and environmental outcomes we want, you know, that they don't necessarily naturally all sit together in perfect harmony. You know, so there's trade-offs between those, and we've set that out as well because that's something, you know, realistically we need to be mindful of. So I won't read over this, but again, it was in the papers that we shared with you in September. But this is our revised vision, and then the 3 strategic objectives that I talked about. So, you know, the economic aspect of that is about transforming economic performance by closing that productivity gap by 2050, based on Brian's work. The inclusive aspect of that, the social inclusive aspect, is about reducing the level of transport-related social exclusion to the rest of England by 2050, based on Tom Jarvis's work that's previously been tabled at this committee. And then the decarbonisation aspect of that ambition is about net zero emissions from surface transport by 2045, based on what we committed to as part of the decarb strategy.
Excuse me, Steve. Can you just go back to your previous slide? A number of us are in combined authorities, or eventually going to be in combined authorities. So at the moment, in theory, North Yorkshire and York will be a combined authority by 2024. And I see no reason why that's not going to happen. But one of the conditions, for want of a better phrase, is that we should have an area transport system in that combined authority that's comparable to Transport for London in 10 years. So it strikes me that your vision, our vision, and I'm presuming that other combined authorities had a different start date to their vision, but those visions exist. So I see, you know, are you slowing us down? So my question really is, my comment and stroke question is, would that not need to be aligned in some way? You know, I mean, we've already talked about leadership and the fact that we want more point of leadership, but we've all got different targets, and yours is different again. I mean, mine's probably to where I live, it's probably 2034. Yours is 2050, that's another 16 years. I know there'll be some slippage, but hopefully not as much as that. I value your comment.
Yeah, no, it's a really valid point. And obviously, you know, when you're developing any kind of strategic plan, whether it's transport or economic, and you're doing that for a multitude of areas, clearly you're going to have these challenges. So, you know, even at combined authority level, you know, local authority aspirations will vary between your patch. So it's always a challenge about kind of marrying that up. I think ultimately it's really important that our strategic transport plan is a long-term vision in terms of where we want to be. So that 2050 target is really critical for us. It's that aspirational, and that's simply particularly in transport related to kind of the funding allocations as currently is. So we know, for example, that David was talking about rail before. Rail kinds of priorities are committed, you know, quite far in advance. So actually for us to influence that, you know, not influencing the next 5 years, we're influencing beyond that. And similarly, you know, we have the same in terms of road with the RIS programme. So, you know, that's why it's really important for Transport for the North to have a long-term vision. What we are looking to do as part of this and as part of the objectives that we've set, again, we've set those headline objectives at that long-term time frame for 2045, 2050, depending on which ones we're talking about. But what we are looking to do is to set some kinds of milestones around those. So to try to work backwards from the long-term ambition we've set and say by 2030, what would good look like? And I think that's really critical. So I'm hoping that that would be a signpost for partners to be able to think about that at the local level. I think also you've got to be mindful, you know, while yes, we all have aspirations to achieve all of this in 10 years, how realistic is that is you know, perhaps sometimes a challenge that we all face. So, you know, for us to kind of achieve all the outcomes we want in 10 years, given the economic climate that Brian talked us through earlier, you know, feels untenable. And so for us as this is our statutory document, it's got to be kind of seen as relatively credible by government, and I think 2050 allows us to do that.
Okay, but I think there should be some recognition of the fact that combined authorities have got a much more onerous target, because otherwise you will lose credibility with the more important partners, which are your local partners. And I just think that there's got to be something in there that really sort of hones that. Even though it might be that this is where you need a little bit of granularity. So you might actually say we have a different strategy in the combined authorities. To give you an idea at the moment on one of the things that's going on with climate change is that the biggest 2,000 companies have all been told they have to report by such a date on what their carbon footprint is. Now that's having an interesting trickle-down effect. So I'm concerned about the branch line to Blackpool, for example. And the trickle-down effect is that a lot of small companies are now getting letters from the big companies saying, we need you to tell us what your carbon footprint is by 2027. And so I just think that even if we have this thing that says Manchester or wherever, you know, sort of North Yorkshire or whatever, has that impetus, it will help bring all the other areas, even if at the end of the day it does end up being 2050. So I'm just like, I'm just uncomfortable that you have a vision that the council, any councillor in North Yorkshire would perhaps not identify with if he's been told that in 10 years' time, as part of the condition of getting £50 million extra a year, we have to drive to that transport situation. So that's really, I just want us to line our ducks up, really.
Yeah, and I think part of that comes through when I'll talk shortly about the policy for places section as well. So, you know, ultimately what the balance we're having to strike with our STP is with the number of partners we've got, people are in very different positions. And this isn't unusual for TfM. We've had to do this, you know, since our existence. In our decarb strategy, for example, when we set the 2045 target, that was really challenging. You'll recall through the conversations we had both at this group and the other governance groups to get to that point, because some partners have set a target of 2030, others haven't set any target, and therefore how do you find a comfortable middle ground that collectively the North can get behind? So, you know, I don't think it's an unfamiliar ground for us. I think you're right. I think in some aspects, you know, what we're trying to do, for example, in the policy for places chapter is to say, you know, we've set some ambitions here, but, you know, how that applies across the North, different places will proceed at different kind of paces in terms of delivering on that, and that's absolutely fine. So we know, for example, some of our Met areas, have much more aspirational targets and further ahead, and that's absolutely fine. But equally, some of our rural and dispersed partners perhaps, are quite clear on what the next steps are for them. So it's about having a framework and a place-based approach that allows that local interpretation through local transport plans as well. But I think there's a way to manage that, and I think you're right. We can certainly have a look at kind of some of the language around how we position that.
Chair, can I just ask a question on that slide as well, please? Just bite my tongue on the inequality of devolution that we have in this country. Well, but let's not forget that a large number of authorities, whether they're a unitary or district or counties, have declared climate emergency, and therefore, as a result of that, they're duty bound to do. I mean, I know there's a speculation about how effective declaring climate emergency actually is. So the question I wanted to ask is, it said reducing level of transport substitution to the rest of England. Well, surely there's TRSE within the north as well.
Yeah.
It's not just to the rest. But probably, I think, surely tackling it within the region first is more important than tackling it as it leads out of the region.
Yeah, really good question. And it's something that it's not in these slides, but it was in the papers that I shared with you in September, and I can reshare with you. Is one of our headline indicators for that. So for TRSE, there's a number that sits underneath that in terms of the objectives, and there's the one that's included here, and then there's a subsequent one around, as you say, that balance between parts of the north, because absolutely that's equally fundamental.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Thanks. It's obvious in there. Yeah, thanks, Sean.
Yeah,
I knew I'd get in trouble for mentioning Blackpool.
well, no, it's broader than that, really. I mean, tomorrow I'm going to the local plan, which is about transport section. And what I'm wondering is, overall, how much is it linked into all the different local plans, which have to be revised every few years? And that is important part of it, I would have thought, than anything else, because you'll be working with local councils and combined authorities when they form.
Yeah, really good question again. So like Brian, we've been doing quite a lot of work with your officers and your partners, just to make sure that our strategic transport plan is complementing what partners are thinking about locally. As you know, the government are currently going through a process of, they're about to reissue the guidance on local transport plans. So that's expected to be released for consultation next month, December, before Christmas. And it'll be adopted kind of sort of next springtime, I think. So I know a lot of partners are in the process of starting to think about their local transport plans. Again, some are quite far forward and have started drafting it, awaiting the outcome of the guidance, whereas others haven't started yet for that process. So yeah, we are doing quite a lot of work with our partners to understand where they are in that process and how we can work with them to support. I think in some ways the fact that the guidance has been delayed, while that's frustrating for local councils and officers, for us in some ways that's quite advantageous. So again, we think about the golden thread of these things. So once that LTP guidance comes out, by March, hopefully we'll have our draft SDP agreed by our boards through governance, and then that sets a framework for local partners to think about their own local transport plans as part of that. And again, when I talk about the policy for places stuff shortly, what we've tried to do within that, based on partners' feedback that they want STP2 to be more place-based, we've tried to think about and give some guidance to local partners around perhaps what might be the policy priorities to consider within local transport plans for different areas, without necessarily being prescriptive around Hull, this is what you need to do, and Manchester, this is what you need to do. So it's about kind of creating a framework that could guide and support partners without necessarily kind of telling people what to do and where, really. So it's a tricky balance we're trying to find.
Thanks.
I'll move on slightly, but I mentioned these. So as I say, we've set a series of kind of headline objectives, targets, and then a series of kind of core metrics as well. So I did share a version of those in September that we took to partnership board and got broad support for. Happy to share those again with this group post meeting if that's useful. They've been slightly updated since then. And happy to kind of take any comments on those. But I think the really important message around all of that is that really moves us on a lot from SDP1. So we didn't have those targets originally. And that makes it quite difficult once you've got your strategy agreed, to then think about, okay, well, what do we do next? Because in the objectives that we had the first time, there's a lot of ambiguity around those, and actually then that makes it difficult to think about how we prioritise our focus, how partners prioritise their own work to deliver on the vision. So I'm really hoping that, you know, the fact we've got more detail and more specifics around what we're trying to achieve, that should hopefully help us drive our own work at TFN, but also for your partners through your local transport plans to really be clearer around what we need to do to actually start to deliver on our vision. And then the policy for places stuff. So we shared with you as part of the pack, I believe, the narratives we've worked up, but again, going back to kind of what partners kind of fed back to us earlier this year, one of the key things that they want to see from STP2 was for STP2 to be much more place-based. So some of the feedback we got was, you know, our first and our current strategic transport plan is valuable to an extent, but actually what does that mean at a local level? How do we use that? It's so high level, you know, how does that really help us in our own kind of transport planning locally? So we've been working through, you know, how do we make STP2 place-based and how do we strike that balance between, you know, what TFN's remit is and not wanting to kind of police partners around what they ought to be doing, but providing enough guidance to kind of make sure that, you know, people are kind of really considering their own plans and how that might align to our collective vision. So through some previous work at TFN, so some work we did off the back of STP1 on agglomeration and clusters, and then some subsequent work that we did in 2020 as part of our strategic development corridor economic narratives work. We've already got as part of our evidence base 9 kind of place typologies, and these are evidence-led and analytically robust. So, you know, TFN hasn't defined the places and how they kind of categorised. It's based on an EU framework and then supplemented with some data from the Office of National Statistics. So they have a classification, an OHD classification. But what that does is that allows us to start to talk about different types of places in the north, their unique characteristics and transport challenges, and helps us start to think about perhaps what the right mix of policies for different places might be to deliver on our vision. It's really important in the place types that we've developed that partners recognise that what we're setting up is a framework here, so it's not a rule book. So, you know, the plan in developing these is to enable flexibility and local interpretation, but to give enough kind of guidance around, you know, there are, you know, the transport solutions for, you know, the Lake District look and feel quite different to the transport solutions for central Manchester. So, you know, it's about trying to kind of draw that out really and support partners in thinking about the multitude of places we all represent. It's also important for partners just to recognise, as well as part of the work we've developed in the narratives, you know, not one local authority is 100% one place type. So again, for us, for our strategic transport plan, but also for you and your officers as part of your own local transport plans, you know, we all need to think about a multitude of places and what the right mix of policies might be to best support those. So this is a mechanism to start to do that.
Yes, Lucy, I think I've probably started.
No.
Did you want that last slide?
Yeah. It's obviously small scale and obviously it's based on other stuff, but I can't work out the difference between the centres and rural, let alone between former metropolitan counties and large conurbations. So.
Yeah, I can give a bit of an explanation of that. So, for example, for the visitor centres, how they're defined in this is very much focused around, you know, where a large part of their economy is based on kinds of, you know, tourism, etc., but primarily seasonal tourism. So, therefore, kind of some of the transport interventions often at the moment are kind of focused on that kind of summer peak, if you like. So a lot of the visitor centres that are kind of captured in here in the narratives give a bit more of a descriptor of that, and some of those real places are places like, you know, Northumberland, for example, as parts of Northumberland, parts of the Lake District, parts of some of our coastal communities, Whitby, Scarborough, some of these places. So that's some of the descriptors there. The two rural ones we've got, there's two different aspects to those. So there's rural town and fringe and rural village and dispersed. So a rural village and dispersed is almost kind of like a hamlet. So you know, the most rural we can get is kind of represented in that rural village and dispersed. Whereas a rural town and fringe perhaps is places such as you know, Hambleton in North Yorkshire. You always kind of apply it to places you know yourself, but they're kind of places where, you know, you might have a small market town that people are travelling into from those really dispersed areas. So again, within those rural definitions, for example, the kind of transport options available kind of vary significantly. If you're that really dispersed option, you know, even by 2050, you're going to heavily be relying on the car to kind of get around, but clearly we want to encourage more sustainable kind of fuels, etc., to kind of support kind of that net zero kind of commitment. We also need to think about, for example, demand response to transport rather than kind of traditional bus, because we know that doesn't work, etc. So what the narratives try to draw out is for each of our different types of places, you know, what perhaps some of them, the kind of unique policies might be. The other one that you mentioned was large conurbations. So I think in some of the definition, the large conurbations and former Met counties are quite interesting, and actually in some instances they're quite similar in terms of how they're defined. So you know, a large proportion of Manchester fits under large conurbations, and former Met counties, again, primarily back in the day, they would have kind of been classed as sort of one kind of conurbation. How it's defined is slightly different now, and I guess part of that is based on kind of the former Met counties perhaps a bit more outside of the kind of central belt of the city region, if you like, but, you know, and perhaps have a bit more of a focus on traditional kind of industries, so factories, etc. You know, you primarily don't get them in the city centre, you get them on the periphery. So again, in the narratives, it draws this out a bit more, that was shared, and provides a bit more of a description on all of that. But just to kind of recap, before I kind of open up further questions, as I say, we've shared those narratives and it gives more of a description on those and the policies. We worked them up internally, and then we had some really good workshop sessions with partners back in October to kind of capture feedback from your officers on those, make sure we're representing all of the kind of policies they would expect to see, making sure that, you know, this kind of captures what they thought and wanted when they talked about STP2 being place-based. We then revised the narratives, which is the version that you guys have seen and has been shared with you. We have also started to prepare the first half of the chapter. So this chapter is kind of split in two. So there's this policy for places stuff that I just talked about at length. And the first half of the chapter is primarily going back to kind of the narrative that we set in STP1 around why you have to connect kinds of different parts of the north together and what that brings. So that kind of corridor approach that you'll be familiar with from our current strategic transport plan. We're also talking about multimodal aspects. So, you know, what are the road priorities, what are the rail priorities, but as well, what else is neither road nor rail, but needs investment to enable the transport system that will deliver on the vision and the objectives we've set. So certain aspects of that might be, for example, refuelling, so hydrogen or electric vehicle charging, you know, really key for delivering decarbonisation. Other aspects of that include buses, so a bit more of a focus around buses, because we know from the transport related social exclusion work, that's really key to kind of delivering that. So that first half of the chapter will set out all that strategic kind of transport priorities, and then the second half then explores and what might that mean locally and what might be best placed. There are my slides. Whistle stop tour, there's a lot to talk about, so I'm really happy to take questions on any of that or read the papers that have been shared previously.
Thank you, Lucy. I think quite a lot of the description of the terms are actually in Appendix 2 that we have today. So that might give you some more detail. And it's something I intend to share with my fellow councillors when I go back to go back to North Yorkshire Council, I think there's some very important detail and thought processes there. So I'll open it up to questions. Councillor Davison.
Yes.
Don't disappoint.
Oh. Well, first of all, thanks for the for this long document, and I don't think there's anything in there that you could argue with. But well, not really. No, I think you've alluded to it yourself. It's the utopia, isn't it? You know, you say we'll live there in 50 years, we'll live there in 100. I don't know, but it's the utopian view that we'd all like to see. What I think's lacking a little bit is what are the small steps that get us from where we are now, which is basically reliance on fossil fuels, and that ain't going to change anytime soon, especially in the current economic climate, you know, where green tends to take a little bit of a backseat. We've just seen that at COP, but there was, apart from giving developing countries a few bob because we're going to flood them out, you know, there's no commitment to doing anything with fossil fuels because, quite frankly, the technology isn't there yet to replace it. A couple of things that I think are probably missing. We talk about trying to get everybody to go onto hydrogen or electric. No mention of the fact that the national grid couldn't possibly support everybody having an electric car. We need another couple of Hinkley B power stations, and even one Hinkley B is probably 30 years away. So we're all looking forward to power cuts this year, and there's a very small amount of electric cars in there in the mix at the moment. Hydrogen is great. I did pin a lot of hopes on hydrogen, but of course its green credentials are questionable, and also the means of transmitting it through the liquid, through the natural gas pipelines. You know, it's far more corrosive, and it's not quite simply a matter of pumping hydrogen through existing gas networks, because it requires major investment to make that happen. So I think for hydrogen vehicles as a whole, we're looking at road delivered hydrogen to tank areas, whether that be local authorities or whoever else wants to use hydrogen at the moment. So we're sort of greenwashing a little bit, if you don't mind the new term, like we greenwash a lot of stuff where we don't really look at the in-depth green credentials, even of electric vehicles, where we know that the batteries are terrible for the environment. We know that electric vehicles are big producers, that they manufacture of them as big producers of carbon. So we like to look at the end user, and I think to me electric vehicles are about more, certainly in cities, the health aspects that we would get by not having hydrocarbons and diesel particulates pumped into the atmosphere. So I think we're not, you know, we're a bit utopian. We're not looking at some of the practicalities in this report, which, and it's not just me who picked them up. Looking at the bus services, I mean, obviously North Lincolnshire is very rural, and as you point out, it's an ageing demographic for some reason. Maybe people want to retire there, I don't know. But we're on our second iteration of on-demand transport, and it ain't worked. We brought it in basically because we are totally reliant on basically Stagecoach and a local provider. They have us over a barrel in terms of running services to the villages, and basically because buses run with two people on, they're by no means economically viable. People are reliant on cars, simply. And I think on demand, it's a strange thing, especially with an aging demographic. They still like to have the certainty of waiting at a bus stop for a bus that's supposed to turn up at 10 o'clock and will get them into the town centre. They're not keen on ringing up or using an iPad to try and book an on-demand thing. So again, whilst we brought on-demand in to try and obviously reduce our subsidy, because we can't keep paying out to Stagecoach to get 3 grannies into town at 10 o'clock, it hasn't worked, and we're having to revisit that one. So I think you're on demand. So again, it's utopian, and it works probably fine in around the periphery of, say, Leeds, where we are now, as indeed public transport works better in big cities. But the rural areas, you've alluded to the problems. It's how there's nothing to say how we can transition people away from cars, how we'll get this bus infrastructure in that will help people to get away from the car. You know, there's nothing in there. It's like we're going from everyone driving a car into the utopia. So, you know, and again, it doesn't really stack up to me. We've got to have the intermediate stages, I think. The other thing about looking at the parking issue in towns, which we've looked at, believe it or not, I think one of the few authorities we have 2 hours free parking. The reason we've done that, and of course York, if you park in York, you need deep pockets, don't you? To say the least. It's tough for a local authority not to use parking as a cash cow, but all the high streets are on the bones of the bum, basically. They've had it, and it's a matter of, yeah, we want footfall in town centres. How are we going to get footfall in a rural area where there isn't a decent bus service? So we've put in free parking. It's been colossally. We've had millions of tickets issued for free, so we've lost a lot of revenue, but it is supporting the town centres to try and recover A from COVID and B from out of town shopping. I mean, a lot set in years ago, didn't it? Without it, you know, it's not just Amazon that's killed off the high street. It started when we had the out of town. And again, what's out of town shopping facilities got? Free parking. People are going to drive in. They want to load the boot up with stuff. They're not going to get on a bus with 5 bags of groceries from Tesco. They're always going to drive. So there's a lot of things in there, isn't there? I think that.
So if we were to paraphrase the last, what, 3 minutes?
Yeah.
It's 5. Yeah, but not that I want to. Are we really saying that you'd like to see what practicalities are we get from A to B?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's your question, Lucy. How do we get from A to B, not to answer all the different questions?
Yeah,
around demand or whatever else.
Yeah, I think all really valid points. I think where I mentioned about the first half of the chapter that we're preparing, that's where you set that strategic kind of argument. So what are the priorities for that? So, you know, some of the challenges you were saying there about, for example, the nuances of decarbonisation and what that looks like and what networks you need to enable that, whether that's energy, whether that's how you actually encourage people to have behavioural change, whether it's broadband, for example, to get people to use like say demand responsive transport in rural areas, for example. It's that systems kind of approach. So I think where I talked about that first half of the 3rd chapter that we're currently drafting and we're going to share with partners in the new year, that's where we start to set all of that stuff out in more detail. And so I think, I appreciate it's difficult seeing some of this as a piecemeal approach or seeing aspects of this without the big picture and how we're framing that. But I'm confident that we'll be able to pick those points up and kind of address those in the draft that you'll see in the new year.
One of the things that's a bit of a blocker for us is that when they privatised buses many moons ago now, you can't go back. So North Lincolnshire, well, its predecessor authority, went purely to Stagecoach and the likes to provide bus services. So unlike, say, Manchester and other cities that still have run their own buses and have their own infrastructure. They've redone it. So we're not allowed actually. So with DRT, you can't run a regular service. You can't interfere with the people who run the buses. You're very, very restricted on DRT. And, we might wish to actually say, right, we want control over our bus services, which would mean perhaps taking them back in-house. Having North Lincolnshire buses, for instance, where we've got control over the budget and we're not at the mercy of Stagecoach, but we're not allowed to do it by legislation. It can't be done. So that's perhaps something that might be worth putting in there.
Yeah, but I mean, just I want to actually bring Matthew in, but essentially on the devolution deal, etc. But at county, we are now taking control. We actually have an option to take more control. Yeah, so that's now changing. But it's going back. It's going back to what it was, I guess. Liverpool as well. Yeah, Liverpool's third. Anyway, Matthew, you had.
Thank you, Chairman. Right, so a few comments. The first thing I would say is actually I'm really enjoying reading through this document. I was quite impressed with it. I think that the setup of the different locations works, and there's some really quite interesting sort of analysis and whatever, particularly under the rural areas. So, you know, first thing to say is actually I think it is looking good. Few comments and issues. So one of them is that under rural villages and dispersed particularly, there's a lot of emphasis on the fact that the demographics very much skew to the older population, which to some extent is as you'd expect. One thing I would say is that there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, because for young adults, for people who are, you know, starting out the working lives 18 to 35, the reality is if you haven't learned to drive, it's very difficult to live in a rural area with poor public transport issues. So to some extent, it's no surprise that the demographics end up as they are. And I do think it's wrong that you can have young people who've grown up in a particular community who might want to live in that community with and family and whatever, and actually find that it just isn't possible. So that's just something I've raised of why that there might be a particular need to think about provision for younger people. Obviously, children who are growing up in that community will be dependent on parents as a taxi service, which can bring its own problems. And there's also an issue with a kind of migration as people get older, that a lot of people will retire into rural areas, but then when they subsequently get too old, they'll actually move back to somewhere with more services nearby, because they'll get to the point where they aren't able to drive anymore, or they're not as mobile as they were. So there can be a problem again that we've got people who are living in these communities, but then having to uproot their life at a point when they are older and there's accessibility issues, whatever, and again, we just need to be mindful of those problems. Something else which I noticed is that there's reference in on page 44, about halfway down, switching to electric vehicles and community-led car clubs. It might be worth mentioning hydrogen vehicles there. I know there's references to hydrogen throughout the document, but hydrogen vehicles may be a possibility, albeit with the caveats as Councillor Davison suggested. I think that, I tell you, the other comment I wanted to make is I felt that under the headings of rural villages and dispersed, the kind of rural town and fringe, and to some extent some of the areas that are in the visitor locations, there's a lot of the same sorts of issues will be applying across different headings. And to some extent, I don't know whether it's worth making some kind of reference to the fact that some of the problems and solutions are the same. I particularly felt under the visitor destinations heading, on my reading of it, that all of the focus is on really the tourists and the kind of seasonality of transport. And there's not much discussion of what provision there needs to be for the people who live there, but throughout the year. And some of them may face similar challenges to some of the other headings. So I don't know how there's a way of just saying that some of the comments that are made under one heading don't really only apply to those people. So that's, I don't know, something I wanted to pick up.
Thanks very much, Matthew. Lucy, I saw you writing lots of stuff down, so I don't want you actually to respond at the same. I want to just see what Councillor Hughes has to say, because I know he has some comments.
Thanks, I know we're probably pushed for time, but I'm trying to move from negativity to a slight degree of positivity, and also address this issue of underuse of bus services where they exist in rural areas, which we talked about before at Scrutiny Committee. And of course, the government did have a chance to do this. They asked all local authorities who had transport responsibility to produce bus service improvement plans, and then they funded only a very small proportion of these. And actually, it was a great initiative because it encouraged the very diversity of approach that we need, urban for urban, rural for rural. But then, there was a somewhat negative result for many areas. But I think we've had this intractable problem, and buses used to be subsidised in Cumbria, and in the challenges following austerity and the financial crisis, we did remove that subsidy, and a lot of other authorities did it as well. And the government now seems to think, sort of post BSIPs, that that demand responsive transport on its own is the answer. And I do agree with Councillor Davies on that one limited point, that they're no good, however bright the idea is, they're no good if there's not the backbone of public transport there for them to feed into, because they're not intended to transport passengers for long distances. They need to connect with trains, which often are non-existent. Certainly, that's been more prevalent recently, or mainstream buses, which are even less visible in many areas. So what I'm hoping we're going to do next year in Westmoreland Furness, our new unity authority, is invite communities to bid where they think they need a standard scheduled bus service. And I don't particularly like competitive ways of awarding funding, but in the stringent circumstances and post-budget, that's where we are. And perhaps give them a year for their local people to prove that the bus service is viable. And then if not, maybe transfer it somewhere else. Now, I haven't had the okay from Cabinet to do that yet, but it seems one way of addressing it. And then nobody can, I mean, there should be more funding for transport, obviously, but then if a bus service is provided by the local authority and it's underused, significantly underused, then the local authority should have no qualms in saying, sorry, we have to move this funding to somewhere else. Just a thought. So I'm not against demand responsive transport, but it needs the mainstream transport in the back.
So Lucy, I'm not going to ask you to respond to that one either. I just want you to take a couple of comments away because I've seen you avidly writing stuff. But what I've picked up from the comments are that, first of all, the foundation it's important that the population, what I'll call the permanent population, is possibly at in the bedrock. And if it's not, I know it's there, but if the inferences suggest it's not, then I just think you need to pick that up. There is other infrastructure issues, and I actually. Believe it or not, I was listening to a thing about energy, on the greening of the football industry. And essentially there are they just think there are three issues. There's what's the energy supply? How do people travel to the matches, and what do they eat when they get there? So obviously the infrastructure is critical. The energy infrastructure is critical. Maybe that has to be a caveat in there that, we've got these great plans, but unless you've got the energy energy infrastructure in order to be able to support that. So I think there's an issue about that. There was comments on air quality, which I think that's an underplayed benefit. I think the quality of air in this country, although we say it's good, I don't think it is. That's why, for those who are old enough to remember driving your cars when it was covered in insects in the summer, certainly I was, but now it's non-existent. So we've done something to kill them off, whether it's the petrol or whether it's whatever. So I don't think air quality is as good as we perhaps make out. But I think the important thing was that Councillor Davison made, and I think it's perhaps my gut feel is there needs to be a lean towards imperfect action as opposed to perfect inaction. We keep discussing a lot of things, we write a lot of papers, but actually if we did some stuff and we got some empirical results, that might, because the minute the minute you engage, it changes the conditions, and suddenly you find something else happens. So I think there needs to be something that says there's an urgency that we start some of these things so we can learn from it as well, and that there's a feedback learning circle. So I'd like to thank you for the very, very comprehensive work you've done. I intend to share that with all my fellow councillors up at North Yorkshire. Not because I don't like them, but because I think it can give them knowledge. So thank you very much. And I don't know if anybody wants to take a 5-minute break before Brian comes on, but Brian's going to be limited to 20 minutes. And then we can all disappear. So does anybody want to take a break, or can I just let Brian loose? Let him loose. No. Thank you, Brian. So just while Brian's setting himself up. Go see. I don't know if there's any.
So are you part of the new administration?
And I'm part of the movement.
Congratulations. We are as well.
I was going to do a Warrington being described as a commuter town. It's North Lincolnshire, was on the. No, it's not a visitor centre, no one wants to visit North Lincolnshire.
I tell you what, the officer that introduced demand-led services. Which works under the accounts. Yeah, well, it's. She just introduced demand-led services. Yeah. Started up on LinkedIn. Some cool things. We'll get people back for you, Brian, just for a second. I've been told that we might lose the room around 1:30, so we don't.
Well, I should get us back on track because I'm presenting this on behalf of Tom, so at least.
Yeah, it'll take me an hour, you know, it's not very good. Realise that the oldest is in that. One way. That's a different stuff.
Okay, Brian, I think we can just set off, just, so Brian's going to do transport and health policy positions here. He's substituting for Tom, or maybe a better benefit than Tom Jarvis. He's got two questions really. The first is, are we taking in the policy paper he's presenting, are we taking the right actions and do we have the right level of ambition? And the second one is, how can we fully reflect health impacts on transport investment decisions? I hope I've got that right.
Yes, you have, and they're repeated on the final slide, so we've got a reminder of what Tom's asking. So, yeah, I'm introducing the transport and health policy position on behalf of Tom. A lesson learned for me when I'm signing off his leave, just to check what he's got in the diary first. So this policy acts on TfN's recent research into transport and health, and supports the development of the strategic transport plan. It follows a similar format for those used, sort of presented for active travel and spatial planning. First, by setting out the policy context in which the research has been done, the challenges in the policy landscape on transport and health, and then TfN's intended role on this issue. And the policy is due to be presented to TfN board in December. So starting with the policy context, in July, TfN completed its research with Cambridge Econometrics on the health and wellbeing impacts of the transport system. So this included mapping out impact pathways, collating and generating data sets and quantifying impacts on mortality. So from the evidence that there is a significant and entrenched, there is evidence of significant and entrenched health inequalities. If you're looking at the chart on the right here, across England. But you'll see the proportion of areas in the north and the rest of England that have high levels of deprivation are measured on the 2019 indices of multiple deprivation. So you can see that nearly a quarter of areas in the north fall into the lowest decile for health deprivation in England, and over half of the areas in the north are in the bottom 30%. So this shows higher levels of early mortality, a greater burden of disease, and poorer mental health and well-being in the north. So the research conducted to underpin this policy demonstrates that there's a clear impact of the transport system contributing to these outcomes. And there are 5 key impact pathways: road traffic incidents and safety, access to healthcare, air pollution, noise pollution, and physical activity. And these links are measurable across the north with some robust evidence. And to highlight one of those links, the map here shows a selection of local authority districts that have both high levels of health deprivation and poor access to health services. One example is in Blackpool. Just under half of the LOSAs have relatively high levels of health deprivation and relatively poor access to hospitals and GP surgeries with the current transport options available. I should also highlight that there's a link to the data tool at the end of the presentation that partners can use to access the data. There are also wider impacts resulting from the transport system that are listed in the policy, which are not currently measurable at the pan-northern geography. And these include user experience, severance, and quality of place. Turning now to the challenges in the policy landscape. First, there is a complex and multidimensional relationship between transport and health. Our evidence currently allows us to measure the impacts individually, but not in combination. So, for example, we can robustly measure the impacts of air pollution and noise pollution from road traffic, but not the combined effect of these. It's much more difficult to assess together. Second, the negative health impacts of transport aren't closely linked with levels of use. And because of that, they aren't well reflected in the costs for individual users, and further research is required. For example, air pollution from car use falls disproportionately on relatively deprived areas where there are fewer car users. Third, this issue crosses multiple policy areas, including many of TfN's policy positions and strategies and those of our stakeholders. Examples include the active travel and spatial planning policy positions that I've already mentioned, which both link to levels of physical activity, and the decarbonisation strategy that links to air pollution from road transport. So this is a challenging policy area because there's a complex relationship with transport decarbonisation, especially around the role of car use. Broadly, an approach to decarbonisation that prioritises modal shift towards active travel and public transport will deliver significant health benefits compared to an approach that maintains a car-dominated transport mix. So the policy proposes the following role and set of actions for TfN to respond to these challenges and findings from our research. First of these is adopting Vision Zero for the major roads network, and using this vision as one of the factors shaping TfN's approach to the major and strategic road networks in the north. This Vision Zero commits to a target of 0 deaths and 0 injuries for all users, including users outside of vehicles. The policy doesn't currently specify a timeline for this, and we'd be welcome to hear feedback from partners in this area. Second, expanding evidence sharing and integration with the Office for Health Inequalities and Disparities and other public health teams across the north, through this integrating integrating more evidence on health impacts in TfN's analytical work. Third, we'd like to develop a tool for identifying and measuring severance effects associated with rail and road infrastructure. This is intended as a research tool filling a current methodological gap, but is also intended to support partners in identifying barriers to active travel and divisions within and between communities linked to road and rail infrastructure. And finally, there's the need to develop a broader impacts costing tool to robustly link different mode splits with different health impacts and examine the gap between user costs and these broader impacts. So there's a lot of research already in this area, including TfN's own wider impacts calculator, and we're proposing to collate this into a transparent and accessible tool for costing health impacts associated with different transport use scenarios. So finally, to wrap up, the 2 questions that Thomas posed for you there, are these the right set of actions and ambitions for TfN? And the second, how can we fully reflect health impacts in transport investment decisions? So a reminder, the policy goes to TfN board in December. Quite happy to make a note of the points that you made today. But after today, if you do have any subsequent feedback for Tom, if you could receive them by the 30th of November, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Are there any questions for Brian?
It's an observation as much as a question. You mentioned Blackpool.
Yeah, apologies.
Well, no, I mean, it is an ongoing problem that we have.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's other places that's got deprivation that have the same problem. They don't take the exercise that other people take because of the problems that they've got. And quite often they can't afford to use public transport because they haven't got the funds to use it. So I just wondered how much that was being tied into all the different towns and places that have that sort of problem.
Well, I did. So yes, I mean, unfortunately, we picked on Blackpool as our example there.
Well, we know we've got one of the most deprived and the lowest life expectation of most places in the area. But part of it, like I say, transport is a big part of how people can get fitter and healthier.
Yeah, and the work that Tom's been leading on in terms of transport-related social exclusion looks at access to things like healthcare services, hospitals, doctors' surgeries, etc. So yeah, this links with that work. But yeah, just to put that that chart that I showed earlier in the presentation, yeah, there are a number of areas across the north because of those levels of deprivation that face similar challenges.
Thank you, Brian. Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, I did assure Brian that I was listening, even though I was carrying out essential work on the laptop as well. So, 2-3 questions. First of all, page 70. Well, first of all, there's little mention of the effects of aircraft on health here, and there is a reference, but not in great detail. And living in a part of the country where the RAF carry out regular sorties, either with jets or helicopters or great big lumbering planes that almost knock your aerial off in the middle of the night. There's a serious concern about the effect on health. I can absolutely guarantee that if there's been an RAF sortie over my village and my valley, the next day an ambulance will roll up and cart somebody away to hospital. It's regular as clockwork. And while some people, most people may be more robust, actually it's an issue. And I think it's a pity that that seems to have missed out, maybe because the RAF aren't recognised as a transport company, which of course they're not. But then there must be similar effects in, well, there are similar effects in urban areas. I know around Manchester Airport and so on. Are you intending on doing more work on that?
I'll take that point away and I'll discuss that with Tom and ask him to come back to you on what.
Well, for all of us, I hope. Yeah.
Yeah. To what?
Yeah.
As to what future plans.
Yeah. Okay. Certainly, in terms of improving air quality, is TfN working strategically with any recognised national bodies on this? Because there's a huge amount of work going on improving air quality. The government have been very tardy because they failed consistently to meet the World Health Organization targets for reduction of CO2, NO2, particulates and so on. But actually, to counter that, there have been many worthwhile local and national initiatives. So I hope you found good partners to work with on that.
I can't fully answer that on Tom's behalf, but Tom is involved in another piece of work on clean mobility visions, and I know as part of that work he's speaking to other transport bodies around the UK, such as Midlands Connect. So he does have links.
Okay, but it's not just transport bodies. Okay, dedicated bodies to tackling it. And there's a magazine I get, and that must be produced by somebody. So I think if we could have that information, that would be great. Talked about, just in terms of modal shift, which a few of us have talked about today. How confident is TfN that some degree of modal shift is underway across the north? And what plans are in place? Perhaps you touched on these already. That plan to make this more rapid in the way that is needed.
Excuse me, Brian, I'm not sure you're in a position to answer that from this particular paper, because this is more of a strategic. This to me, this report is a very shocking report, and my fellow committee members will be saying that you should be leveraging this in terms of the arguments for why transport for the north should be going ahead. I think these figures are outrageously shocking. Notwithstanding Blackpool, there are other areas that I do that. I mean, one of my party pieces when I talk about cars is that, roughly speaking, about 1,800 people get killed on the roads every year. However, we also know that another 10,000 actually die as a result of air quality issues from the car emissions. Therefore, my question is how many people actually die on our roads? So I say you're bringing out a lot of things here. A couple of observations I'd like to make, and a couple of actions I will take as a result of this paper is, the first is I will send it to my public health people at North Yorkshire and say, hey, what's going on here? And how can we get some funds for this? I will also take it to overview and scrutiny of health at my council, and I'll be going, how do we push this into the NHS such that we get the NHS and public health supporting TfN with its ambition? Because at the end of the day, this has got to save lives and save money. And I just think this is just empirically wrong. So I know Lucy had a comment to make, so please come in, Lucy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back on, I guess, some of the questions that Councillor Hughes sort of made there. So in terms of the air quality stuff and who are we working with broader than that, it's probably a conversation for our colleague Peter Cole, who leads our decarbonisation work, to come back to the committee to speak on. But we are engaging with the Committee for Climate Change around their work on that. Brian briefly mentioned we've been doing some really interesting work around clean mobility visions, and a lot of that's looked into decarbonising the network and how you encourage modal shift as well. So again, potentially that's a topic for further discussion at a future scrutiny committee. And then linked to that, the other kind of point that you raised, both on this item and an item earlier, was around ownership and the importance of that. So there's a couple of different ways that that's kind of being picked up across TFN. So where I talked about the vision and objectives for STP2, that is one of our headline targets. So we're setting some right share targets for mode shift of what we'd like that to look like by 2050, what that needs to be. So through some future work that we're planning to do next year to revise our future travel scenarios, we're then going to relook at that. So we've got an idea of what that's based on the previous travel scenarios work, but we need to recast that in light of the economic kind of targets that the IER work is going to recast for us in the next few weeks. So that's some further work where we'll relook at that again, looking at that into different futures. And again, that clean mobility visions work also touches on that. So potentially all areas for future scrutiny discussion.
Okay, thanks very much.
I'd like to thank you, Lucy. Unless there are any other questions, I would like to thank Brian for bringing this piece of work to us. I'd also like to thank all the officers for all the papers they brought to us today. I'd like to thank the committee members that are all here, and I'd like to apologise for running over by 30 minutes. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.